Don't forget to subscribe. Afterwards, the wisest and most spiritual books from the greatest authors await you every day. And now buckle up, sit back and we'll begin. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. The Secret Doctrine. The Zodiac and its Antiquity. All men are apt to have a high conceit of their own understanding and to be tenacious of the opinions they profess, said Jordan, justly adding to this, and yet almost all men are guided by the understandings of others, not by their own, and may be said more truly to adopt than to beget their opinions. This is doubly true in regard to scientific opinions upon hypotheses offered for consideration. The prejudice and preconceptions of authorities, so called, often deciding upon questions of the most vital importance for history. There are several such predetermined opinions held by our learned Orientalists, and few are more unjust or illogical than the general error with regard to the antiquity of the Zodiac. Thanks to the hobby of some German Orientalists, English and American Sanskritists have accepted Professor Weber's opinion that the peoples of India had no idea or knowledge of the Zodiac prior to the Macedonian invasion, and that it is from the Greeks that the ancient Hindus imported it into their country. We are further told by several other authorities that no Eastern nation knew of the Zodiac before the Hellenes kindly acquainted their neighbors with their invention. And this, in the face of the Book of Job, which is declared, even by themselves, to be the oldest in the Hebrew canon, and certainly prior to Moses, a book which speaks of the making of Arcturus, Orion, and Pleiades, Arsh, Kessel, and Kima, and the chambers of the south, of Scorpio and the Mazareth, the 12 signs, words which, if they mean anything, imply knowledge of the Zodiac, even among the nomadic Arabian tribes. The Book of Job is alleged to have preceded Homer and Hesiod by at least 1,000 years, the two Greek poets having themselves flourished some 8 centuries before the Christian era. Though, by the by, one who prefers to believe Plato, who shows Homer flourishing far earlier, could point to a number of zodiacal signs mentioned in the Iliad and Odyssey, in the Orphic poems, and elsewhere. But since the cock and bull hypothesis of some modern critics that, so far from Orpheus, not even Homer or Hesiod has ever existed, it would seem time lost to mention these archaic authors at all. The Arabian Job will suffice, unless, indeed, his volume of Lamentations, along with the poems of the two Greeks, to which we may add those of Linus, should now also be declared to be the patriotic forgery of the Jew Aristobulus. But if the Zodiac was known in the days of Job, how could the civilized and philosophical Hindus have remained ignorant of it? Risking the arrows of modern criticism rather blunted by misuse, the reader may make himself acquainted with Bailey's learned opinion upon the subject. Inferred speculations may be shown to be erroneous. Mathematical calculations stand on more secure grounds. Taking as a starting point several astronomical references in Job, Bailey devised a very ingenious means of proving that the earliest founders of the science of the Zodiac belonged to an antediluvian primitive people. The fact that he seems willing to see some of the biblical patriarchs in Thoth, Seth, and in the Chinese Fohi does not interfere with the validity of his proof as to the antiquity of the Zodiac. Even accepting, for argument's sake, his cautious 3,700 years BC as the correct age of the zodiacal science, this date proves in the most irrefutable way that it was not the Greeks who invented the Zodiac, for the simple reason that they did not exist as a nation 37 centuries, at any rate, not as a historical race admitted by the critics. Bailey then calculated the period at which the constellations manifested the atmospheric influence called by Job, the sweet influences of the Pleiades in Hebrew Kima, that of Orion, Kessel, and that of the desert trains with reference to Scorpio, the eighth constellation, and found that in presence of the eternal conformity of these divisions of the zodiac, and of the names of the planets applied in the same order everywhere and always, and in presence of the impossibility of attributing it all to chance and coincidence which never creates such similarities, a very great antiquity indeed must be allowed for the zodiac. Again, if the Bible is supposed to be an authority on any matter, and there are some who still regard it as such, whether from Christian or Kabbalistical considerations, then the zodiac is clearly mentioned in Kings 5. Before the book of the law was found by Hilkiah, the high priest, the signs of the zodiac were known and worshipped. These were held in the same adoration as the sun and moon, since the priests, whom the kings of Judah had ordained to burn incense unto Baal, to the sun, and to the moon, and to the planets, and to all the host of heaven, or to the 12 signs or constellations as the marginal note in the English Bible explains, had followed the injunction for centuries. They were stopped in their idolatry only by King Josiah, 624. The Old Testament is full of allusions to the 12 zodiacal signs, and the whole scheme is built upon it: heroes, personages, and events. Thus in the dream of Joseph, who saw 11 stars bowing to the 12th, which was his star, the zodiac is referred to. The Roman Catholics have discovered in it, moreover, a prophecy of Christ, who is that 12th star, they say, and the others the 11 apostles, the absence of the 12th being also regarded as a prophetic allusion to the treachery of Judas. The 12 sons of Jacob, again, are a reference to the same, as is justly pointed out by Villapondus. Sir James Malcolm, in his History of Persia, shows the Dabistan echoing all such traditions about the zodiac. He traces the invention of it to the palmy days of the Golden Age of Iran, remarking that one of the said traditions maintains that the genii of the planets are represented under the same shapes and figures they had assumed when they showed themselves to several holy prophets, and thus led to the establishment of the rites based on the zodiac. Pythagoras, and after him Philo-Judaeus, held the number 12 as very sacred. This duodinary number is perfect. It is that of the signs of the zodiac, which the sun visits in 12 months, and it is to honor that number that Moses divided his nation into 12 tribes, established the 12 cakes of the shew bread, and placed 12 precious stones upon the breastplate of the pontiffs. According to Seneca, Berosus taught prophecy of every future event and cataclysm by the zodiac, and the times fixed by him for the conflagration of the world pralaya and for a deluge are found to answer to the times given in an ancient Egyptian papyrus. Such a catastrophe comes at every renewal of the cycle of the sidereal year of 25,868 years. The names of the Akkadian months were called by, and derived from, the names of the signs of the zodiac, and the Akkadians are far earlier than the Chaldeans. Mr. Proctor shows, in his Myths and Marvels of Astronomy, that the ancient astronomers had acquired a system of the most accurate astronomy 2,400 years BC. The Hindus date their Kali Yuga from a great periodical conjunction of the planets 31 centuries BC. But, withal, it was the Greeks, belonging to the expedition of Alexander the Great, who were the instructors of the Aryan Hindus in astronomy. Whether the origin of the zodiac is Aryan or Egyptian it is still of an immense antiquity. Simplicius, in the 6th century AD, writes that he had always heard that the Egyptians had kept astronomical observations and records for a period of 630,000 years. This statement appears to frighten Mr. Gerald Massey, who remarks on it that, if we read this number of years by the month which Eudoxus said the Egyptians termed a year a course of time, that would still yield the length of 2 cycles of precession 51,736 years. Diogenes Laertius carried back the astronomical calculations of the Egyptians to 48,863 years before Alexander the Great. Martianus Capella corroborates this by telling posterity that the Egyptians had secretly studied astronomy for over 40,000 years before they imparted their knowledge to the world. Several valuable quotations are made in Natural Genesis with the view of supporting the author's theories, but they justify the teaching of the secret doctrine far more. For instance, Plutarch is quoted from his Life of Sulla, saying, "One day when the sky was serene and clear, there was heard in it the sound of a trumpet, so loud, shrill, and mournful, that it affrighted and astonished the world." The Tuscan sages said that it portended a new race of men and a renovation of the world, for they affirmed that there were 8 several kinds of men, all being different in life and manners, and that heaven had allotted each its time, which was limited by the circuit of the great year 25,868 years. This reminds one strongly of our 7 races of men, and of the 8 the animal man descended from the later 3rd race, as also of the successive submersions and destruction of the continents, which finally disposed of almost all that race. Says Iamblichus, the Assyrians have not only preserved the memorials of 7 and 20 myriads of years, 270,000 years, as Hipparchus says they have, but likewise of the whole apocatastases and periods of the 7 rulers of the world. This is as nearly as possible the calculation of the esoteric doctrine. For 1,000,000 years are allowed for our present route trace, the 5th, and about 850,000 years have passed since the submersion of the last large island part of the continent of Atlantis, the Ruta of the 4th race, the Atlanteans, while Dytia, a small island inhabited by a mixed race, was destroyed about 270,000 years ago, during the glacial period or thereabouts. But the 7 rulers, or the 7 great dynasties of the divine kings, belong to the traditions of every great people of antiquity. Wherever 12 are mentioned, they are invariably the 12 signs of the Zodiac. So patent is this fact that the Roman Catholic writers, especially among the French ultramontanes, have tacitly agreed to connect the 12 Jewish patriarchs with the signs of the Zodiac. This is done in a kind of prophetico-mystic way, which sounds to pious and ignorant ears like a portentous token, a tacit divine recognition of the chosen people of God, whose finger has purposely traced in heaven, from the beginning of creation, the numbers of these patriarchs. For instance, curiously enough, these writers, de Merville among others, recognize all the characteristics of the 12 signs of the Zodiac in the words addressed by the dying Jacob to his sons, and in his definitions of the future of each tribe. Moreover, the respective banners of the same tribes are said to have exhibited the same symbols and the same names as the signs, repeated in the 12 stones of the Urim and Thummim, and on the 12 wings of the 2 cherubs. Leaving to the said mystics the proof of exactitude in the alleged correspondence, we quote it as follows. Man, Aquarius, is in the sphere of Reuben, who is declared as unstable as water, The Vulgate has it, rushing like water, Gemini, in that of Simeon and Levi, because of their strong fraternal association, Leo, in that of Judah, the strong lion of his tribe, the lion's whelp, Pisces, in Zabulon, who shall dwell at the haven of the sea, Taurus, in Issachar, because he is a strong ass couching down etc. And therefore associated with the stables, Scorpio, in Dan, who is described as a serpent, an adder in the path that biteth, Capricornus in Naphtali, who is a hind, a deer, let loose, Cancer, in Benjamin, for he is ravenous, Libra, the balance, in Asher, whose bread shall be fat, Sagittarius in Joseph, because his bow abode in strength. To make up for the 12th sign, Virgo, made independent of Scorpio, we have Dinah, the only daughter of Jacob. Tradition shows the alleged tribes carrying the 12 signs on their banners. But indeed the Bible, in addition to the above, is filled with theocosmological and astronomical symbols and personifications. It remains to wonder and to query if the actual living patriarch's destiny was so indissolubly wound up with the zodiac how it is that, after the loss of the 10 tribes, the 10 signs also out of the 12 have not miraculously disappeared from the sidereal fields. But this is of no great concern. Let us rather busy ourselves with the history of the zodiac itself. The reader may be reminded of some opinions expressed as to the zodiac by several of the highest authorities in science. Newton believed that the invention of the zodiac could be traced as far back as the expedition of the Argonauts, and Euler fixed its origin at 6,500 years BC, just 2,496 years before the creation of the world, according to the Bible chronology. Cruiser thought that it was very easy to show that most of the theogonies were intimately connected with religious calendars and were related to the zodiac as to their prime origin, if not to the zodiac known to us now, then to something very analogous with it. He felt certain that the zodiac and its mystic relations are at the bottom of all the mythologies, under one form or another, and that it had existed in the old form for ages, before it was brought out in the present defined astronomical garb, owing to some singular coordination of events. Whether the genii of the planets or Dayan Chohins of supramundane spheres showed themselves to holy prophets or not, as claimed in the Dabistan, it would seem that great laymen and warriors were favored in the same way in days of old in Chaldea, when astrological magic and theophania went hand in hand. Xenophon, no ordinary man, narrates of Cyrus that at the moment of his death, he thanked the gods and heroes for having so often instructed him themselves about the signs in heaven. Unless the science of the zodiac is admitted to be of the highest antiquity and universality, how can we account for its signs being traced in the oldest theogonies? Laplace is said to have felt struck with amazement at the idea of the days of Mercury, Wednesday, Venus, Friday, Jupiter, Thursday, Saturn, Saturday, and others, being related to the days of the week in the same order, and with the same names in India as in Northern Europe. Try, if you can, with the present system of autochthonous civilizations, so much in fashion in our day, to explain how nations with no ancestry, no traditions or birthplace in common, could have succeeded in inventing a kind of celestial phantasmagoria, a veritable imbroglio of sidereal denominations, without sequence or object, having no figurative relation with the constellations they represent, and still less, apparently, with the phases of our terrestrial life they are made to signify, had there not been a general intention and a universal cause and belief, At the root of all this, most truly has Dupuy asserted the same. Est impossible de découvrir le moindre trait de ressemblance entre les parties du si les figures que les astronomes y Ontario arbitrairement traces, et de l'autre côté, le hasard est impossible. Most certainly chance is impossible. There is no chance in nature, wherein everything is mathematically coordinate and interrelated in its units. Says Coleridge. Chance is but the pseudonym of God or nature for those particular cases which he does not choose to subscribe openly with his sign manual. Replace the word God by karma, and it will become an Eastern axiom. Therefore, the sidereal prophecies of the Zodiac, as they are called by Christian mystics, never point to any one particular event, however solemn and sacred it may be for some one portion of humanity, but to ever recurrent, periodical laws in nature, understood only by the initiates of the sidereal gods themselves. No occultist, no astrologer of Eastern birth, will ever agree with Christian mystics, or even with Kepler's mystical astronomy, his great science and erudition notwithstanding. And this because, if his premises are quite correct, his deductions therefrom are one-sided and biased by Christian preconceptions. Where Kepler finds a prophecy directly pointing to the Savior, other nations see a symbol of an eternal law, decreed for the actual Manvantara. Why see in Pisces a direct reference to Christ, one of the several world reformers, a savior for his direct followers, but only a great and glorious initiate for all the rest, when that constellation shines as a symbol of all the past, present, and future spiritual saviors, who dispense light and dispel mental darkness? Christian symbologists have tried to prove that this sign belonged to Ephraim, Joseph's son, the elect of Jacob, and that therefore, it was at the moment of the sun's entering into the sign of Pisces, the fish, that the elect Messiah of the first Christians had to be born. But if Jesus of Nazareth was that Messiah, was he really born at that moment, or was his birth hour thus fixed by the adaptation of theologians, who sought only to make their preconceived ideas fit in with sidereal facts and popular belief? Everyone is aware that the real time and year of the birth of Jesus are totally unknown. And it is the Jews whose forefathers made the word dag signify both fish and Messiah during the forced development of their rabbinical language who are the first to deny this Christian claim. And what of the further facts that Brahmins connect their Messiah, the eternal avatar of Vishnu, with a fish in the deluge, and that the Babylonians also made a fish and a Messiah of their Dagon, the man-fish and prophet? There are learned iconoclasts among Egyptologists who say that when the Pharisees sought a sign from heaven, Jesus said, "There shall no sign be given, but the sign of the prophet Jonas." The sign of Jonas is that of the owner fish man of Nineveh. Assuredly there was no other sign than that of the sun reborn in Pisces. The voice of the secret wisdom says those who are looking for signs can have no other than that of the returning fish man Ichthys, Ons, or Jonas, who could not be made flesh. It would appear that Kepler maintained it as a positive fact that, at the moment of the incarnation, all the planets were in conjunction in the sign Pisces, called by the Jewish Kabbalists the constellation of the Messiah. Kepler averred, "It is in this constellation that the star of the Magi is to be found." This statement, quoted from Drive. Sepp by de Merville, emboldened the latter to remark that all the Jewish traditions, while announcing that star that many nations have seen, further added that it would absorb the 70 planets that preside over the destinies of various nations on this globe. In virtue of those natural prophecies, says Drive. Sep, it was written in the stars of the firmament that the Messiah would be born in the lunar year of the world 4320, in that memorable year when the entire choir of the planets would be celebrating its jubilee. There was indeed a rage, at the beginning of the present century, for claiming restoration from the Hindus for an alleged robbery from the Jews of their gods' patriarchs and chronology. It was Wilford who recognized Noah and Prithi and in Satyavrata, Ennis and Dhruva, and even Asur and Ishvara. After being residents for so many years in India, some Orientalists, at least, ought to have known that it was not the Brahmins alone who had these figures, or who had divided their great age into 4 minor ages. Nevertheless, writers in the Asiatic researches indulged in the most extravagant speculations. S.A. Mackey, the Norwich philosopher, astronomer, and shoemaker, argues very pertinently. Christian theologians think it their duty to write against the long periods of Hindu chronology, and in them it may be pardonable. But when a man of learning crucifies the names and the numbers of the ancients, and wrings and twists them into a form which means something quite foreign to the intention of the ancient authors, but which, so mutilated, fits in with the birth of some maggot pre-existing in his own brain with so much exactness that he pretends to be amazed at the discovery, I cannot think him quite so pardonable. This is intended to apply to Captain, later Colonel, Wilford, but the words may fit more than one of our modern Orientalists. Colonel Wilford was the first to crown his unlucky speculations on Hindu chronology and the Puranas by connecting the 4,320,000 years with biblical chronology, by simply dwarfing the figures to 4,320 years, the supposed lunar year of the Nativity, and Dr. Sepp has simply plagiarized the idea from this gallant officer. Moreover, he persisted in seeing in them Jewish property, as well as Christian prophecy, thus accusing the Aryans of having helped themselves to Semitic revelation, whereas the reverse was the case. The Jews, moreover, need not be accused of directly despoiling the Hindus, of whose figures Ezra probably knew nothing. They had evidently and undeniably borrowed them from the Chaldeans, along with the Chaldean gods. They turned the 432,000 years of the Chaldean divine dynasties into 4,320 lunar years, from the world's creation to the Christian era. As to the Babylonian and Egyptian gods, they quietly and modestly transformed them into patriarchs. Every nation was more or less guilty of such refashioning and adaptation of a pantheon once common to all of universal, international, and tribal gods and heroes. It was Jewish property in its new Pentateuchal garb, and no one of the Israelites has ever forced it upon any other nation, least of all upon the European. Without stopping to notice this very unscientific chronology more than is necessary, we may yet make a few remarks that may be found to the point. The 4,320 lunar years of the world in the Bible, the solar years are not fanciful, as such, even if their application is quite erroneous, for they are only the distorted echo of the primitive esoteric, and later of the Brahmanical doctrine concerning the yugas. A day of Brahma equals 4,320,000,000 years, as also does a night of Brahma, or the duration of Pralaya, after which a new sun rises triumphantly over a new Manvantara, for the septenary chain it illuminates. The teaching had penetrated into Palestine and Europe centuries before the Christian era, and was present in the minds of the Mosaic Jews, who based upon it their small cycle, though it received full expression only through the Christian chronologers of the Bible, who adopted it, as also the 25th of December, the day on which all the solar gods were said to have been incarnated. What wonder, then, that the Messiah was made to be born in the lunar year of the world 4320. The Sun of Righteousness and Salvation had once more arisen and had dispelled the prolaic darkness of chaos and non-being on the plane of our objective little globe and chain. Once the subject of the adoration was 720 settled upon, it was easy to make the supposed events of his birth, life, and death fit in with the zodiacal exigencies and the old traditions, though they had to be somewhat remodeled for the occasion. Thus what Kepler said, as a great astronomer, becomes comprehensible. He recognized the grand and universal importance of all such planetary conjunctions, each of which, as he has well said, is a climacteric year of humanity. The rare conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars has its significance and importance on account of its certain great results in India and China, as much as it has in Europe for the respective mystics of these countries. And it is certainly now no better than a mere assumption to maintain that nature had only Christ in view in building her to the profane, fantastic and meaningless constellations. If it is claimed that it was no hazard that could lead the archaic architects of the Zodiac thousands of years ago to mark the figure of Taurus with the asterisk A, with no better or more valid proof of it being prophetic of the verbum or Christ than that the Aleph of Taurus means the one and the first, and that Christ was also the Alpha or the One, then this proof may be shown to be strangely invalidated in more than one way. To begin with, the zodiac existed before the Christian era, at all events. Further, all the sun gods Osiris, for instance, had been mystically connected with the constellation Taurus, and were all called by their respective votaries the first. Further, the compilers of the mystical epithets given to the Christian Savior were all more or less acquainted with the significance of the zodiacal signs, and it is easier to suppose that they should have arranged their claims so as to match the mystic signs than that the latter should have shown as a prophecy for one portion of humanity for millions of years, taking no heed of the numberless generations that had gone before and of those that were to be born hereafter. We are told, it is not simple chance that, in certain spheres, has placed on a throne the head of this bull Taurus, trying to push back a dragon with the ansated cross. We should know that this constellation of Taurus was called the Great City of God, and the Mother of Revelations, and also the interpreter of the divine voice, the Epispasis of Hermontis, in Egypt, which as the patristic fathers would assure the world is said to have proffered oracles that related to the birth of the Savior. To this theological assumption there are several answers. Firstly, the ansated Egyptian cross, or Tau, the Jaina cross, or Svastika, and the Christian cross have all the same meaning. Secondly, no peoples or nations except the Christians gave the significance to the dragon that is given to it now. The serpent was the symbol of wisdom, and the bull, Taurus, the symbol of physical or terrestrial generation. Thus the bull, pushing off the dragon, or spiritual divine wisdom, with the Tau, or cross, which is esoterically the foundation and framework of all construction, would have an entirely phallic physiological meaning, had it not had yet another significance unknown to our biblical scholars and symbologists. At any rate, it has no special reference to the verbum of St. John, except, perhaps, in a general sense. The Taurus, which, by the way, is no lamb, but a bull, was sacred in every cosmogony, with the Hindus as with the Zoroastrians, with the Chaldees as with the Egyptians. So much, every schoolboy knows. It may perhaps help to refresh the memory of our theosophists if we refer them to what was said of the Virgin and the Dragon, and the universality of periodical births and rebirths of world saviors, solar gods in Isis Unveiled, with regard to certain passages in Revelation. In 1853, the savant known as Erard Malian read before the Institute of France a paper tending to prove the antiquity of the Indian zodiac, in the signs of which were found the root and philosophy of all the most important religious festivals of that country. The lecturer tried to demonstrate that the origin of these religious ceremonies goes back into the night of time to at least 3000 BC. The zodiac of the Hindus, he thought, was long anterior to the zodiac of the Greeks and differed from it much in some particulars. In it one sees the dragon on a tree, at the foot of which the Virgin, Kanya Durga, one of the most ancient goddesses, is placed on a lion dragging after it the solar car. He said, "This is the reason why this Virgin Durga is not the simple memento of an astronomical fact, but verily the most ancient divinity of the Indian Olympus. She is evidently the same whose return was announced in all the Sibylline books, the source of the inspiration of Virgil, an epic of universal renovation. And why, since the months are still named after this Indian solar zodiac by the Malayalam-speaking people of southern India, should that people have abandoned it to take that of the Greeks? Everything proves, on the contrary, that these zodiacal figures were transmitted to the Greeks by the Chaldeans, who got them from the Brahmins. But all this is very poor testimony. Let us, however, remember also that which was said and accepted by the contemporaries of Volney, who remarks that as Aries was in its 15th degree, 1447 BC, it follows that the first degree of Libra could not have coincided with the vernal equinox later than 15,194 years BC. If we add to this, he argues, the 1,790 years that have passed since the birth of Christ, it appears that 16,984 years must have elapsed since the origin of the zodiac. Dr. Schlegel, moreover, in his Uranography Chinoise, assigns to the Chinese astronomical sphere an antiquity of 18,000 years. Nevertheless, as opinions quoted without adequate proofs are of little avail, it may be more useful to turn to scientific evidence. M. Bailly, the famous French astronomer of the last century, member of the Academy, etc., asserts that the Hindu systems of astronomy are by far the oldest, and that from them the Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, and even the Jews derived their knowledge. In support of these views he says, the astronomers who preceded the epoch 1491 are, first, the Alexandrian Greeks, Hipparchus, who flourished 125 years before our era, and Ptolemy, 260 years after Hipparchus. Following these were the Arabs, who revived the study of astronomy in the 9th century. These were succeeded by the Persians and the Tartars, to whom we owe the tables of Nasreddin in 1269, and those of Ulig Beg in 1437. Such is the succession of events in Asia as known prior to the Indian epoch 1491. What, then, is an epoch? It is the observation of the longitude of a star at a given moment, the place in the sky where it was seen, and which serves as a point of reference a starting point from which to calculate both the past and future positions of the star from its observed motion. But an epoch is useless unless the motion of the star has been determined. A people, new to science and obliged to borrow a foreign astronomy, finds no difficulty in fixing an epoch, since the only observation needed is one which can be made at any moment. But what it needs above all, what it is obliged to borrow, are those elements which depend on accurate determination and which require continuous observation, above all, those motions which depend on time and which can only be accurately determined by centuries of observation. These motions, then, must be borrowed from a nation which has made such observations and has behind it the labors of centuries. We conclude, therefore, that a new people will not borrow the epochs of an ancient one without also borrowing from them the average motions. Starting from this principle, we shall find that the Hindu epochs 1491 and 3102 could not have been derived from those of either Ptolemy or Ulugh Beg. There remains the supposition that the Hindus, comparing their observations in 1491 with those previously made by Ulugh Beg and Ptolemy, used the intervals between these observations to determine the average motions. The date of Ulugh Beg is too recent for such a determination, while those of Ptolemy and Hipparchus were barely remote enough. But if the Hindu motions had been determined from these comparisons, the epochs would be connected together. Starting from the epochs of Ulugh Beg and Ptolemy, we should arrive at all those of the Hindus. Hence, foreign epochs were either unknown or useless to the Hindus. We may add to this another important consideration. When a nation is obliged to borrow from its neighbors the methods or the average motions of its astronomical tables, it has even greater need to borrow, besides these, the knowledge of the inequalities of the motions of the heavenly bodies, the motions of the apogee, of the nodes, and of the inclination of the ecliptic, in short, all those elements the determination of which requires the art of observing, some instrumental appliances, and great industry. All these astronomical elements, differing more or less with the Greeks of Alexandria, the Arabs, the Persians and the Tartars, exhibit no resemblance whatever with those of the Hindus. The latter, therefore, borrowed nothing from their neighbors. If the Hindus did not borrow their epoch, they must have possessed a real one of their own, based on their own observations, and this must be either the epoch of the year 1491 after, or that of the year 3102 before our era, the latter preceding by 4,592 years the epoch 1491. We have to choose between these two epochs and to decide which of them is based on observation. But before stating the arguments which can and must decide the question, we may be permitted to make a few remarks to those who may be inclined to believe that it is modern observations and calculations which have enabled the Hindus to determine the past positions of the heavenly bodies. It is far from easy to determine the celestial movements with sufficient accuracy to ascend the stream of time for 4,592 years, and to describe the phenomena which must have occurred at that period. We possess today excellent instruments. Exact observations have been made for some 2 or 3 centuries, which already permit us to calculate with considerable accuracy the average motions of the planets. We have the observations of the Chaldeans, of Hipparchus and of Ptolemy, which, owing to their remoteness from the present time, permit us to fix these motions with greater certainty. Still, we cannot undertake to represent with invariable accuracy the observations throughout the long period intervening between the Chaldeans and ourselves, and still less can we undertake to determine with exactitude events occurring 4,592 years before our day. Cassini and Mayer have each determined the secular motion of the moon, and they differ by 3 meters 43. This difference would give rise in 46 centuries to an uncertainty of nearly 3 degrees in the moon's place. Doubtless one of these determinations is more accurate than the other, and it is for observations of very great antiquity to decide between them. But in very remote periods, where observations are lacking, it follows that we are uncertain as to the phenomena. How, then, could the Hindus have calculated back from the year 1491 AD to the year 3102 before our era, if they were only recent students of astronomy? The Orientals have never been what we are. However high an opinion of their knowledge we may form from the examination of their astronomy, we cannot suppose them ever to have possessed that great array of instruments which distinguishes our modern observatories, and which is the product of simultaneous progress in various arts, nor could they have possessed that genius for discovery, which has hitherto seemed to belong exclusively to Europe, and which, supplying the place of time, causes the rapid progress of science and of human intelligence. If the Asiatics have been powerful, learned and wise, it is power and time which have produced their merit and success of all kinds. Power has founded or destroyed their empires, now it has erected edifices imposing by their bulk, now it has reduced them to venerable ruins. And while these vicissitudes alternated with each other, patience accumulated knowledge, and prolonged experience produced wisdom. It is the antiquity of the nations of the East which has erected their scientific fame. If the Hindus possessed in 1491 a knowledge of the heavenly motions sufficiently accurate to enable them to calculate backwards for 4592 years, it follows that they could only have obtained this knowledge from very ancient observations. To grant them such knowledge, while refusing them the observations from which it is derived, is to suppose an impossibility. It would be equivalent to assuming that at the outset of their career, they had already reaped the harvest of time and experience. While on the other hand, if their epoch of 3102 is assumed to be real, it would follow that the Hindus had simply kept pace with successive centuries down to the year 1491 of our era. Thus, time itself was their teacher. They knew the motions of the heavenly bodies during these periods, because they had seen them, and the duration of the Hindu people on earth is the cause of the fidelity of its records and the accuracy of its calculations. It would seem that the problem as to which of the two epochs of 3102 and 1491 is the real one ought to be solved by one consideration, viz. that the ancients in general, and particularly the Hindus, as we may see by the arrangement of their tables, calculated, and therefore observed, eclipses only. Now, there was no eclipse of the sun at the moment of the epoch 1491, and no eclipse of the moon either 14 days before or after that moment. Therefore the epoch 1491 is not based on an observation. As regards the epoch 3102, the Brahmins of Turvalur place it at sunrise on February 18th. The sun was then in the first point of the zodiac according to its true longitude. The other tables show that at the preceding midnight the moon was in the same place, but according to its average longitude. The Brahmins tell us also that this first point, the origin of their zodiac, was, in the year 3102, 54 degrees behind the equinox. It follows that the origin the first point of their zodiac was therefore in the 6th degree of Aquarius. There occurred, therefore, about this time and place an average conjunction, and indeed this conjunction is given in our best tables. Locales for the sun and mayors for the moon. There was no eclipse of the sun, the moon being too distant from her node, but 14 days later, the moon having approached the node, must have been eclipsed. Mayer's tables, used without correction for acceleration, give this eclipse, but they place it during the day when it could not have been observed in India. Cassini's tables give it as occurring at night, which shows that Mayer's motions are too rapid for distant centuries, when the acceleration is not allowed for, and which also proves that in spite of the improvement of our knowledge, we can still be uncertain as to the actual aspect of the heavens in past times. Therefore we believe that, as between the two Hindu epochs, the real one is the year 3102, because it was accompanied by an eclipse which could be observed, and which must have served to determine it. This is a first proof of the truth of the longitude assigned by the Hindus to the sun and the moon at this instant, and this proof would perhaps be sufficient, were it not that this ancient determination becomes of the greatest importance for the verification of the motions of these bodies, and must therefore be borne out by every possible proof of its authenticity. We notice, first, that the Hindus seem to have combined two epochs together into the year 3102. The Turbaluru Brahmins reckon primarily from the first moment of the Kali Yuga, but they have a second epoch placed 2d3h 32 meters 30s later. The latter is the true astronomical epoch, while the former seems to be a civil era. But if this epoch of the Kali Yuga had no reality, and was the mere result of a calculation, why should it be thus divided? Their calculated astronomical epoch would have become that of the Kali Yuga, which would have been placed at the conjunction of the sun and the moon, as is the case with the epochs of the three other tables. They must have had some reason for distinguishing between the two, and this reason can only be due to the circumstances and the time of the epoch, which therefore could not be the result of calculation. This is not all. Starting from the solar epoch determined by the rising of the sun on February 18, 3102, and tracing back events 2d3h 32 meters 30s, we come to 2h 27 meters 30s am of February 16th, which is the instant of the beginning of Kali Yuga. It is curious that this age has not been made to commence at one of the four great divisions of the day. It might be suspected that the epoch should be midnight, and that the 2h 27 meters 30s are a meridian correction. But whatever may have been the reason for fixing on this moment, it is plain that were this epoch the result of calculation, it would have been just as easy to carry it back to midnight, so as to make the epoch correspond to one of the chief divisions of the day, instead of placing it at a moment fixed by the fraction of a day. Second, the Hindus assert that at the first moment of Kali Yuga, there was a conjunction of all the planets, and their tables show this conjunction while ours indicate that it might actually have occurred. Jupiter and Mercury were in exactly the same degree of the ecliptic, Mars being 8-10, Saturn 17 distant from it. It follows that about this time, or some 15 days after the commencement of Kali Yuga, and as the sun advanced in the Zodiac, the Hindus saw four planets emerge successively from the sun's rays, first Saturn, then Mars, then Jupiter and Mercury, and these planets appeared united in a somewhat small space. Although Venus was not among them, the taste for the marvelous caused it to be called a general conjunction of all the planets. The testimony of the Brahmins here coincides with that of our tables, And this evidence, the result of a tradition, must be founded on actual observation. Third, we may remark that this phenomenon was visible about a fortnight after the epoch, and exactly at the time when the eclipse of the moon must have been observed, which served to fix the epoch. The two observations mutually confirm each other, and whoever made the one must have made the other also. Fourth, we may believe also that the Hindus made at the same time a determination of the place of the moon's node. This seems indicated by their calculation. They give the longitude of this point of the lunar orbit for the time of their epoch, and to this they add as a constant 40 meters, which is the node's motion in 12D14H. It is as if they stated that this determination was made 13 days after their epoch, and that to make it correspond to that epoch, we must add the 40 meters through which the node is retrograded in the interval. This observation is, therefore, of the same date as that of the lunar eclipse, thus giving three observations, which are mutually confirmatory. Fifth, it appears from the description of the Hindu zodiac given by M.C. Gentle, that on it the places of the stars named the Eye of Taurus and the Wheat Ear of Virgo can be determined for the commencement of the Kali Yuga. Now, comparing these places with the actual positions, reduced by our precession of the equinoxes to the moment in question, we see that the point of origin of the Hindu zodiac must lie between the 5th and 6th degree of Aquarius. The Brahmins, therefore, were right in placing it in the 6th degree of that sign, the more so since this small difference may be due to the proper motion of the stars, which is unknown. Thus it was yet another observation which guided the Hindus in this fairly accurate determination of the first point of their movable zodiac. It does not seem possible to doubt the existence in antiquity of observations of this date. The Persians say that 4 beautiful stars were placed as guardians at the 4 corners of the world. Now it so happens that at the commencement of Kali Yuga, 3000 or 3100 years before our era, the eye of the bull and the heart of the scorpion were exactly at the equinoctial points, while the heart of the lion and the southern fish were pretty near the solstitial points. An observation of the rising of the Pleiades in the evening, 7 days before the autumnal equinox, also belongs to the year 3000 before our era. This and similar observations are collected in Ptolemy's calendars, though he does not give their authors, and these, which are older than those of the Chaldeans, may well be the work of the Hindus. They are well acquainted with the constellation of the Pleiades, and while we call it vulgarly the Pisciniaire, they name it Pilalukoti, the hen and chickens. This name has, therefore, passed from people to people, and comes to us from the most ancient nations of Asia. We see that the Hindus must have observed the rising of the Pleiades, and have made use of it to regulate their years and their months, for this constellation is also called Kritika. Now they have a month of the same name, and this coincidence can only be due to the fact that this month was announced by the rising or setting of the constellation in question. But what is even more decisive as showing that the Hindus observed the stars, and in the same way that we do, marking their position by their longitude, is a fact mentioned by Augustinus Riccius, that, according to observations attributed to Hermes, and made 1985 years before Ptolemy, the brilliant star and the Lyre, and that in the heart of the Hydra, were each 7 degrees in advance of their respective positions as determined by Ptolemy. This determination seems very extraordinary. The stars advance regularly with respect to the equinox. and Ptolemy ought to have found the longitudes 28 degrees in excess of what they were 1985 years before his time. Besides, there is a remarkable peculiarity about this fact, the same error or difference being found in the positions of both stars. Therefore, the error was due to some cause affecting both stars equally. It was to explain this peculiarity that the Arab Thebath imagined the stars to have an oscillatory movement, causing them to advance and recede alternately. This hypothesis was easily disproved, but the observations attributed to Hermes remained unexplained. Their explanation, however, is found in Hindu astronomy. At the date fixed for these observations, 1985 years before Ptolemy, the first point of the Hindu zodiac was 35 degrees in advance of the equinox. Therefore, the longitudes reckoned for this point are 35 degrees in excess of those reckoned from the equinox. But after the lapse of 1985 years, the stars would have advanced 28 degrees, and there would remain a difference of only 7 degrees between the longitudes of Hermes and those of Ptolemy, and the difference would be the same for the two stars, since it is due to the difference between the starting points of the Hindu zodiac and that of Ptolemy, which reckons from the equinox. This explanation is so simple and natural that it must be true. We do not know whether Hermes, so celebrated in Antiquity, was a Hindu, but we see that the observations attributed to him are reckoned in the Hindu manner, and we conclude that they were made by the Hindus, who, therefore, were able to make all the observations we have enumerated and which we find noted in their tables. Sixth, the observation of the year 3102, which seems to have fixed their epoch, was not a difficult one. We see that the Hindus, having once determined the moon's daily motion of 13-10-35, made use of it to divide the zodiac into 27 constellations, related to the period of the moon, which takes about 27 days to describe it. It was by this method that they determined the positions of the stars in this zodiac. It was thus they found that a certain star of the Lyre was in 8's24, the heart of the Hydra in 4's7, longitudes which are ascribed to Hermes, but which are calculated on the Hindu zodiac. Similarly, they discovered that the wheat ear of Virgo forms the commencement of their 15th constellation, and the Eye of Taurus the end of the 4th, these stars being the one in 6's 640, the other in 1's 2320 of the Hindu zodiac. This being so, the eclipse of the moon, which occurred 15 days after the Kali Yuga epoch, took place at a point between the wheat ear of Virgo and the star Sedilla of the same constellation. These stars are very approximately a constellation apart, the one beginning the 15th, the other the 16th. Thus it would not be difficult to determine the moon's place by measuring her distance from one of these stars. From this they deduced the position of the sun, which is opposite to the moon, and then, knowing their average motions, they calculated that the moon was at the first point of the zodiac, according to her average longitude at midnight on the 17th-18th February of the year 3102 before our era, and that the sun occupied the same place 6 hours later, according to his true longitude, an event which fixes the commencement of the Hindu year. 7th. The Hindus state that 20,400 years before the age of Kali Yuga, the first point of their zodiac coincided with the vernal equinox, and that the sun and moon were in conjunction there. This epoch is obviously fictitious, but we may inquire from what point, from what epoch, the Hindus set out in establishing it. Taking the Hindu values for the revolution of the sun and moon, viz. 363d6h 12 meters 30s and 27d7h 43 meters 13s. We have 20,400 revolutions of the Sun equals 7,451,277 d2h 272,724 revolutions of the Moon equals 7,451,277 d7h. Such is the result obtained by starting from the Kali Yuga epoch, and the assertion of the Hindus that there was a conjunction at the time stated is founded on their tables, but if, using the same elements, we start from the era of the year 1491, or from another placed in the year 1282, of which we shall speak later, there will always be a difference of almost 1 or 2 days. It is both just and natural, in verifying the Hindu calculations, to take those among their elements which give the same result as they had themselves arrived at, and to set out from that one among their epochs, which enables us to arrive at the fictitious epoch in question. Hence, since to make this calculation they must have set out from their real epoch, the one which was founded on an observation, and not from any of those which were derived by this very calculation from the former, it follows that their real epoch was that of the year 3102 before our era. 8th. The Turvalura Brahmins give the moon's motion as 7s on the movable zodiac, and as 9k is referred to the equinox in a great period of 1,600,984 days, or 4,386 years and 94 days. We believe this motion to have been determined by observation, and we must state at the outset that this period is of an extent which renders it but ill-suited to the calculation of the mean motions. In their astronomical calculations, the Hindus make use of periods of 248, 3031, and 12,372 days, but, apart from the fact that these periods, though much too short, do not present the inconvenience of the former, they contain an exact number of revolutions of the moon, referred to its apogee. They are in reality mean motions. The great period of 1,600,984 days is not a sum of accumulated revolutions. There is no reason why it should contain 1,600,984, rather than 1,600,985 days. It would seem that observation alone must have fixed the number of days and marked the beginning and end of the period. This period ends on the 21st of May, 1282 of our era, at 5h 15 meters 30s. At Benners. The determination of the moon's place by the Brahmins thus differs only by 9 minutes from ours, and that of the apogee by 22 minutes, and it is very evident that they could only have obtained this agreement with our best tables, and this exactitude in the celestial positions by observation. If then, observation fixed the end of this period, there is every reason to believe that it determined its commencement. But then this motion, determined directly and from nature, would of necessity be in close agreement with the true motions of the heavenly bodies. And in fact the Hindu motion during this long period of 4,883 years does not differ by a minute from that of Cassini, and agrees equally with that of Mayer. Thus two peoples, the Hindus and the Europeans, placed at the two extremities of the world, and perhaps as distant by their institutions, have obtained precisely the same results as regards the moon's motions, and an agreement which would be inconceivable if it were not based on the observation and mutual imitation of nature. We must remark that the four tables of the Hindus are all copies of the same astronomy. It cannot be denied that the Siamese tables existed in 1687, when they were brought from India by M. de L'Albert. At that time the tables of Cassini and Mayer were not in existence, and thus the Hindus were already in possession of the exact motion contained in these tables, while we did not yet possess it. It must, therefore, be admitted that the accuracy of this Hindu motion is the point of observation. It is exact throughout this period of 4,383 years, because it was taken from the sky itself, and if observation determined its close, it fixed its commencement also. It is the longest period which has been observed, and of which the recollection is preserved in the annals of astronomy. It has its origin in the epoch of the year 3102 BC, and it is a demonstrative proof of the reality of that epoch. Bailey is referred to at such length, as he is one of the few scientific men who have tried to do full justice to the astronomy of the Aryans. From John Bentley down to Burgess's Surya Siddhanta, not one astronomer has been fair enough to the most learned people of antiquity. However distorted and misunderstood the Hindu symbology may be, no occultist can fail to do it justice once that he knows something of the secret sciences, nor will he turn away from their metaphysical and mystical interpretation of the Zodiac, even though the whole Pleiades of Royal Astronomical Societies rise in arms against their mathematical rendering of it. The descent and reascent of the monitor soul cannot be disconnected from the zodiacal signs, and it looks more natural, in the sense of the fitness of things, to believe in a mysterious sympathy between the metaphysical soul and the bright constellations, and in the influence of the latter on the former, than in the absurd notion that the creators of heaven and earth have placed in heaven the types of 12 vicious Jews. And if, as the author of the Gnostics and Their Remains asserts, the aim of all the Gnostic schools and the later Platonists was to accommodate the old faith to the influence of Buddhistic theosophy, the very essence of which was that the innumerable gods of the Hindu mythology were but names for the energies of the first triad, in its successive avatars or manifestations unto man. Whither can we better turn to trace these theosophic ideas to their very root than to the old Indian wisdom? We say again, archaic occultism would remain incomprehensible to all if it were to be rendered otherwise than through the more familiar channels of Buddhism and Hinduism. For the former is the emanation of the latter, and both are children of one mother, ancient Lemuro-Atlantean wisdom. Summary of the position. The reader has had the whole case presented to him from both sides, and it remains with him to decide whether its summary stands in our favor or not. If there were such a thing as a void, a vacuum in nature, one ought to find it produced, according to a physical law, in the minds of helpless admirers of the lights of science, who pass their time in mutually destroying their teachings. If ever the theory that two lights make darkness found its application, it is in this case, where one half of the lights imposes its forces and modes of motion on the belief of the faithful, and the other half opposes the very existence of the same. Ether, matter, energy, the sacred hypostatical trinity, the three principles of the truly unknown God of science, called by them physical nature. Theology is taken to task and ridiculed for believing in the union of three persons in one Godhead, one God as to substance, three persons as to individuality, and we are laughed at for our belief in unproved and unprovable doctrines, in angels and devils, gods and spirits. And, indeed, That which made the scientists win the day over theology in the great conflict between religion and science was precisely the argument that neither the identity of that substance nor the triple individuality claimed after having been conceived, invented, and worked out in the depths of theological consciousness could be proved to exist by any scientific inductive process of reasoning, least of all by the evidence of our senses. Religion must perish, it is said, because it teaches mysteries. Mystery is the negation of common sense and science repels it. According to Mr. Tyndall, metaphysics is fiction like poetry. The man of science takes nothing on trust, rejects everything that is not proven to him, while the theologian accepts everything on blind faith. The theosophist and the occultist, who take nothing on trust, not even exact science, the spiritualist who denies dogma but believes in spirits and in invisible but potent influences, all share in the same contempt. Very well, then, what we have to do now is to examine for the last time whether exact science does not act precisely in the same way as do theosophy, spiritualism, and theology. In a work by Mr. S. Lang, considered a standard book on science and modern thought, the author of which, according to the laudatory review of the Times, exhibits with much power and effect the immense discoveries of science and its numerous victories over old opinions whenever they have the rashness to challenge conclusions with it, we read as follows. What is the material universe composed of? Ether, matter, energy. We stop to ask, what is ether? And Mr. Lang answers in the name of science. Ether is not actually known to us by any test of which the senses can take cognizance, but is a sort of mathematical substance which we are compelled to assume in order to account for the phenomena of light and heat. And what is matter? Do you know more about it than you do about the hypothetical agent, ether? In perfect strictness, it is true that chemical investigations can tell us nothing directly of the composition of living matter, and it is also in strictness true that we know nothing about the compositions of any material body whatever as it is. And energy? Surely you can define the third person of the Trinity of your material universe? We can take the answer from any book on physics. Energy is that which is only known to us by its effects. Pray explain, for this is rather hazy. In mechanics there is actual and potential energy, work actually performed, and the capacity for performing it. As to the nature of molecular energy or forces, the various phenomena which bodies present show that their molecules are under the influence of two contrary forces, one which tends to bring them together, and the other to separate them. The first force is called molecular attraction. The second force is due to the vis viva, or moving force. Just so, it is the nature of this moving force, of this vis viva, that we want to know. What is it? We do not know, is the invariable answer. It is an empty shadow of my imagination, explains Mr. Huxley in his Physical Basis of Life. Thus the whole structure of modern science is built on a kind of mathematical abstraction on a protean substance, which eludes the senses, du bois-riemann, and on effects, the shadowy and elusive will-o'-the-wisps of a something entirely unknown to, and beyond the reach of, science. Self-moving atoms, self-moving suns, planets, and stars. But who, then, or what are they all, if they are self-endowed with motion? Why then should you, physicists, laugh at and deride our self-moving Archias? Mystery is rejected and scorned by science, And as Father Felix has truly said, she cannot escape it. Mystery is the fatality of science. The language of the French preacher is ours, and we quote it in Isis Unveiled. Who, he asks, who of you, men of science, has been able to penetrate the secret of the formation of a body, the generation of a single atom? What is there, I will not say at the center of a sun, but at the center of an atom? Who has sounded to the bottom the abyss in a grain of sand? The grain of sand, gentlemen, has been studied 4,000 years by science. She has turned and returned it. She divides it and subdivides it. She torments it with her experiments. She vexes it with her questions to snatch from it the final word as to its secret constitution. She asks it, with an insatiable curiosity, shall I divide the infinitesimally? Then suspend it over this abyss. Science hesitates, she stumbles, she feels dazzled, she becomes dizzy. And in despair says, I do not know. But if you are so fatally ignorant of the genesis and hidden nature of a grain of sand, how should you have an intuition as to the generation of a single living being? Whence in the living being does life come? Where does it commence? What is the life principle? Do the men of science deny all these charges? By no means. For here is a confession of Tyndall, which shows how powerless is science, even over the world of matter. The first marshalling of the atoms, on which all subsequent action depends, baffles a keener power than that of the microscope. Through pure excess of complexity, and long before observation can have any voice in the matter, the most highly trained intellect, the most refined and disciplined imagination, retires in bewilderment from the contemplation of the problem. We are struck dumb by an astonishment which no microscope can relieve, doubting not only the power of our instrument, but even whether we ourselves possess the intellectual elements which will ever enable us to grapple with the ultimate structural energies of nature. How little is known of the material universe, indeed, has now been suspected for years, on the very admissions of these men of science themselves. And now there are some materialists who would even make away with ether, or whatever science calls the infinite substance, the noumenon of which the Buddhists call Svabhavat, as well as with atoms, too dangerous both on account of their ancient philosophical and their present Christian and theological associations. From the earliest philosophers, whose records pass to posterity, down to our present age, which, if it denies invisible beings in space, can never be so insane as to deny a plenum of some sort, the fullness of the universe, has been an accepted belief. And what it was said to contain, one learns from Hermes Trismegistus, in Drive. Anna Kingsford's able rendering, who is made to say, concerning the void my judgment is that it does not exist, that it never has existed, and that it never will exist, for all the various parts of the universe are filled, as the earth also is complete and full of bodies, differing in quality and in form, having their species and their magnitude, one larger, one smaller, one solid, one tenuous. The larger are easily perceived, the smaller are difficult to apprehend, or altogether invisible. We know only of their existence by the sensation of feeling, wherefore many persons deny such entities to be bodies, and regard them as simply spaces, but it is impossible there should be such spaces. For if indeed there should be anything outside the universe, then it would be a space occupied by intelligible beings analogous to the universe's divinity. I speak of the genii, for I hold they dwell with us, and of the heroes who dwell above us, between the earth and the higher airs, wherein are neither clouds nor any tempest. and we hold it too. Only, as already remarked, no Eastern initiate would speak of spheres above us, between the earth and the airs even the highest, as there is no such division or measurement in occult speech, no above, as no below, but an eternal within two other withins, or the planes of subjectivity merging gradually into that of terrestrial objectivity, this being for man the last one, his own plane. This necessary explanation may be closed here by giving, in the words of Hermes, the belief on this particular point of the whole world of mystics. There are many orders of the gods, and in all there is an intelligible part. It is not to be supposed they do not come within the range of our senses. On the contrary, we perceive them better even than those which are called visible. There are then gods, superior to all appearances. After them come the gods whose principle is spiritual, these gods being sensible, in conformity with their double origin, manifest all things by a sensible nature, each of them illuminating his works one by another. The supreme being of heaven, or of all that is comprehended under this name, is Zeus, for it is by heaven that Zeus gives life to all things. The supreme being of the sun is light, for it is by the disk of the sun that we receive the benefit of the light. The 36 horoscopes of the fixed stars have for supreme being, or prince, him whose name is Pantamorphos, or having all forms, because he gives divine forms to divers types. The 7 planets, or wandering spheres, have for supreme spirits fortune and destiny, who uphold the eternal stability of the laws of nature throughout incessant transformation and perpetual agitation. The ether is the instrument or medium by which all is produced. This is quite philosophical and in accordance with the spirit of Eastern esotericism. For all the forces, such as light, heat, electricity, etc., are called the gods esoterically. This, indeed, must be so, since the esoteric teachings in Egypt and India were identical. And, therefore, the personification of Fohit, synthesizing all the manifesting forces in nature, is a legitimate result. Moreover, as will be shown later, the real and occult forces in nature only now begin to be known, and even in this case, by heterodox, not orthodox, science, though their existence, in one instance at any rate, is corroborated and certified by an immense number of educated people, and even by some official men of science. The statement, moreover, in stanza vi that Fohit sets in motion the primordial world germs, or the aggregation of cosmic atoms and matter, some one way, some the other way in the opposite direction, looks orthodox and scientific enough. For there is, at all events, in support of this position, one fact fully recognized by science, and it is this. The meteoric showers, periodical in November and August, belong to a system moving in an elliptical orbit around the Sun. The aphelion of this ring is 1,732 millions of miles beyond the orbit of Neptune. Its plane is inclined to the Earth's orbit, and the direction of the meteoric swarm moving round this orbit is contrary to that of the Earth's revolution. This fact, recognized only in 1833, shows it to be the modern rediscovery of what was very anciently known. Fohit turns with his 2 hands in contrary directions. The seed and the curds, or cosmic matter, in clearer language, is turning particles in a highly attenuated condition, and nebulae. Outside the boundaries of the solar system, it is other suns, and especially the mysterious central sun, the abode of the invisible deity, as some reverend gentlemen have called it, that determines the motion and the direction of bodies. That motion serves also to differentiate the homogeneous matter, round and between the several bodies, into elements and sub-elements unknown to our Earth. And these are regarded by modern science as distinct individual elements, whereas they are merely temporary appearances, changing with every small cycle within the Manvantara, some esoteric works, calling them Kalpic masks. Fohit is the key in occultism which opens and unriddles the multiform symbols and allegories in the so-called mythology of every nation, demonstrating the wonderful philosophy and the deep insight into the mysteries of nature contained in the Egyptian and Chaldean, as well as in the Aryan religions. Fohit, shown in his true character, proves how deeply versed were all those prehistoric nations in every science of nature, now called the physical and chemical branches of natural philosophy. In India, Fohit is the scientific aspect of both Vishnu and Indra, the latter older and more important in the Rig Veda than his sectarian successor, while in Egypt, Fohit was known as Tum-Ishud of Nut, or Osiris in his character of a primordial god, creator of heaven and of beings. For Tum is spoken of as the protean god who generates other gods and gives himself the form he likes, the master of life, giving their vigor to the gods. He is the overseer of the gods, and he who creates spirits and gives them shape and life. He is the north wind and the spirit of the west, and finally the setting sun of life or the vital electric force that leaves the body at death. Wherefore the defunct begs the tomb should give him the breath from his right nostril, positive electricity, that he might live in his second form. Both the hieroglyph and the text of chapter 42 in the Book of the Dead show the identity of Tum and Fohit. The former represents a man standing erect with the hieroglyph of the breaths in his hands. The latter says, "I open to the chief of an Heliopolis. I am Tum. I cross the water spilt by Thought Hapi, the lord of the horizon, and am the divider of the earth." Fohit divides space and, with his sons, the earth into 7 zones. I cross the heavens. I am the 2 lions. I am Ra, I am Om, I eat my air. I glide on the soil of the field of Anru, given me by the master of limitless eternity. I am a germ of eternity. I am Tum, to whom eternity is accorded. The very word used by Fohit in the 11th book, and the very titles given him. In the Egyptian papyri, the whole cosmogony of the secret doctrine is found scattered about in isolated sentences, even in the Book of the Dead. Number 7 is quite as much insisted upon and emphasized therein as in the Book of Zion. The great water, the deeper chaos, is said to be 7 cubits deep, cubits standing here of course for divisions, zones, and principles. Therein, in the Great Mother, all the gods and the 7 great ones are born. Both Fohit and Tum are addressed as the great ones of the 7 magic forces, who conquer the serpent of pap or matter. No student of occultism, however, ought to be betrayed by the usual phraseology used in the translations of Hermetic works into believing that the ancient Egyptians or Greeks spoke of and referred, monk-like, at every moment in conversation, to a supreme being, God, the one Father and Creator of all, in the way found on every page of such translations. No such thing indeed, and those texts are not the original Egyptian texts. They are Greek compilations, the earliest of which does not go beyond the early period of Neoplatonism. No Hermetic work written by Egyptians, as we may see by the Book of the Dead, would speak of the one universal God of the monotheistic systems, the one absolute cause of all, was as unnameable and unpronounceable in the mind of the ancient philosopher of Egypt as it is forever unknowable in the conception of Mr. Herbert Spencer. As for the Egyptian in general, as M. Maspero well remarks, whenever he arrived at the notion of divine unity, the God one was never God simply. M. Lepage Renouf very justly observed that the word Nauter, Nauti, God, had never ceased to be a generic name to become a personal one. Every God was the one living and unique God with them. Their monotheism was purely geographical. If the Egyptian of Memphis proclaimed the unity of Ptah to the exclusion of Ammon, the Theban Egyptian proclaimed the unity of Ammon to the exclusion of Ptah, as we now see done in India in the case of the Shaivas and the Vaishnavas. Ra, the one god at Heliopolis, is not the same as Osiris, the one god at Abydos, and can be worshipped side by side with him, without being absorbed by him. The one god is but the god of the nome or the city, Nauter Nauti, and does not exclude the existence of the one god of the neighboring town or nome. In short, whenever we are speaking of Egyptian monotheism, we ought to speak of the gods one of Egypt, and not of the one god. It is by this feature, preeminently Egyptian, that the authenticity of the various so-called Hermetic books ought to be tested, and it is totally absent from the Greek fragments known under this name. This proves that a Greek Neoplatonic, or perhaps a Christian hand, had no small share in the editing of such works. Of course, the fundamental philosophy is there, and in many a place intact. But the style has been altered and smoothed in a monotheistic direction, as much, if not more than that of the Hebrew Genesis in its Greek and Latin translations. They may be Hermetic works, but not works written by either of the two Hermes, or rather, by thought. Hermes, the directing intelligence of the universe, or by thought, is terrestrial incarnation called Trismegistus, of the Rosetta Stone. But all is doubt, negation, iconoclasm and brutal indifference, in our age of 100 isms and no religion. Every idol is broken save the golden calf. Unfortunately, no nation or nations can escape their karmic fate, any more than can units and individuals. History itself is dealt with by the so-called historians as unscrupulously as legendary lore. For this, Augustin Thierry has made the amende honorable, if one may believe his biographers. He deplored the erroneous principle that made all the would-be historiographers lose their way, and each presume to correct tradition, that vox populi, which 9 times out of 10 is vox Dei, and he finally admitted that in legend alone rests real history, for he adds, legend is living tradition, and 3 times out of 4 it is truer than what we call history. While materialists deny everything in the universe, save matter, archaeologists are trying to dwarf antiquity and seek to destroy every claim of ancient wisdom by tampering with chronology. Our present-day Orientalists and historical writers are to ancient history that which the white ants are to the buildings in India. More dangerous even than those termites, the modern archaeologists, the authorities of the future in the matter of universal history, are preparing for the history of past nations, the fate of certain edifices in tropical countries. As said Michelet, history will tumble down and break into atoms in the lap of the 20th century, devoured to its foundations by her analysts. Very soon, indeed, under their combined efforts, it will share the fate of those ruined cities in both Americas, which lie deeply buried under impassable virgin forests. Historical facts will remain concealed from view by the inextricable jungles of modern hypotheses, denials and skepticism. But very happily actual history repeats herself, For she proceeds, like everything else, in cycles and dead facts and events deliberately drowned in the sea of modern skepticism, will ascend once more and reappear on the surface. The very fact that a work with pretensions to philosophy, which is also an exposition of the most abstruse problems, has to be commenced by tracing the evolution of mankind from what are regarded as supernatural beings' spirits will arouse the most malevolent criticism. Believers in, and the defenders of, the secret doctrine, however, will have to bear the accusation of madness and worse, as philosophically as for long years already the writer has done. Whenever a theosophist is taxed with insanity, he ought to reply by quoting from Montesquieu's Letters Persanes. By opening so freely their lunatic asylums to their supposed madmen, men only seek to assure each other that they are not themselves mad. And that's not all. Our experts and regular viewers respond to all comments. Also check if you forgot to subscribe and set your bell to receive notifications about new audiobooks and other useful self-development materials that we release regularly. Join in the discussions, don't forget to give likes and, if possible and inspired, support the development of the channel financially. All useful links will be in the description and the first attached comment. Goodness, love and wisdom to all. And now move on to watch the next part of the video at the links below, or choose something from the playlists of the channel and those you see on the screen.